So, and welcome to Willa and Beth and Kathryn, these dear colleagues and friends who are going to help seed this conversation today. It's just such a joy to be with everybody. I felt prompted, and also please forgive my throaty voice at the end of a whopper cold that I strongly recommend avoiding, but I feel better than I sound. So I felt prompted to invite this conversation about community because despite it being a foundation of counsel practice and of course the Counsel on the Uncertain Human Future work, most of us probably haven't really explored its meaning very deeply. I had the feeling that there might be some gifts for us in hidden dimensions of this word, this idea, communitas, community, the big whole. What can we learn by looking a little more deeply at what we're doing here? And so in common usage, the word community is such a familiar, kind of comfortable, ordinary term. We use it in so many contexts. It just rolls off our tongue. Yet from another perspective, it actually signals this condition of our larger abiding and the condition on which our existence hinges, actually. So I think when we notice that, it really begins to open it up in different ways. I hope today we can complicate this understanding in a way that expands our awareness, especially given the stakes. Something, Kyle, did you say something? No, okay, sorry. So it's an obvious place for us to begin to look at the practice of counsel itself, which is an archetypal form of community, even communitas, or this liminal space of human being. In its heart, counsel is the ancient means and container by which we listen together. We actually become receptors for discerning from a larger field that what could guide us in understanding our well-being or direction or even survival. I have been very influenced by the Nigerian visionary Bayo Akomolafe. I know a lot of you know about him as well, who's been provocative about this concept of community for a while in his very poetic way. 5 years ago, he wrote, "At a time when we can no longer afford to stay ensconced in our fortified bastions of self, when we must make the long and tempestuous journey to the other, when community is making a startling comeback to our reckoning, I believe we are being invited into a more stunning vibrancy of things, into a commonwealth of breath, a thicker we, into knotty situations with monstrous others, into realization that knowledge is confusion with confusion. Agency is dispersed, identity is mangled and indeterminate, and the world is always an ongoing, iterative materialization." So I'm wondering if we, as he has, can lean into this more complex and messy fullness of community, the multiplicity and uncertainty and life-sustaining dimensions of it. This, as I may have written in one of our messages, the scientific definition of community gives us an opening. It describes community as a fundamental state of interaction and interdependence existing throughout nature, like a pond, like a planet. So when I spent time with this definition, I was struck by how it describes our condition. It's not about distinguishing subsets of community, although they're there, but that we are beyond choosing part of an evolving, interwoven mycelial network and process of being. That is a way of understanding community. Finally, Joanna Macy, of course, suggests beautifully that in our quest for sustainability, indeed survival, we are learning to see our lives within a larger context. For more and more of us, that larger context is the story of life on Earth. That fullness of presence is, I believe, the greatest gift we can make. For this, the fostering of community is essential. A group working together creates a field of synergy where intersecting relationships reinforce the intentions of our hearts and minds. Groups build courage to face the facts. They also help us see the great turning that is underway. So our three wonderful partners in thinking about this today each bring such wisdom to these questions in their own thinking, their commitments, and the ways they live. Willa Blythe Baker is a Buddhist teacher, scholar, and writer, and founder and spiritual director of Natural Dharma Fellowship. And she's also an original member of the National Council on the Uncertain Human Future. Beth Sawin is co-founder of Climate Interactive and the originator of the multi-solving approach to climate challenges. A biologist, original member also of the National Council, and she lives in a co-housing community in Vermont. Kathryn Harris Tijerina is a citizen of the Comanche Nation. She's served in a range of national, state, and local policy and leadership positions, and she's an attorney, and she's a longtime member of the Santa Fe Council on the Uncertain Human Future. So please, each of you, please reflect on what about community is on your mind and heart today. And Willa, if you can start, you can also add how that has and does manifest in your own experience. And each guest will take about 10 minutes to talk about this, and then we'll talk about it together a bit. So over to Willa.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I just wanted to reflect back how rich you're bringing the biological perspective into community as an ecosystem. You know, that like an ecosystem, there are balances. And I just, anyway, found that very, very helpful, very rich. So when Sarah invited us to come together to talk about community, it was serendipitous for myself. So I accepted. I'm not sure if I would have accepted without this serendipity. I just feel like, even looking around at this community here on this Zoom screen, I just feel like any one of you could talk about community in a way that was wise and articulate. But the condition that was serendipitous is that I had been asked to write an article about community by a magazine. And when I first got that question, the first thing I thought is I have to refuse because I don't know what to say about community. I felt like I'd never really articulated to myself or to others, for certainly, what is community. And yet I wondered, why did they ask me? Why me? Why ask me that question? Why did they reach out? And I thought, well, okay, I have lived much of my life in intentional community. So I guess it was maybe that. In monastic, I was a monastic for 12 years, and I was in intentional community for over 15 years in a very tight-knit monastery kind of community, in a Buddhist monastery. And then now I have devoted my life to creating community, and yet I didn't know how to articulate what is community. So it so happened that she asked me at that moment when I was beginning to articulate it. And so I thought I might start with sharing just just a little bit of perspective from the Buddhist tradition. In that tradition, the word that we use for community, first of all, is Sangha. And in the wider Buddhist context, when we turn towards, when we take refuge in the teacher, the teachings, and the community. So the community is one of the three pillars of contemplative life from within the Buddhist tradition. And I point that out because, in other words, community is essential to living, to evolving. And this word, Sangha, the word is Sanskrit, that the Buddha talked about in his teachings as this pillar of human evolution. This word in Sanskrit means the gathering, the community of virtue. It means the community of virtue. And so to kind of translate that, what the word community means, this word community in Sanskrit, is the gathering together of people in order to accomplish what is right and good, in order to move towards beneficial action. So inherent in the word community in Sanskrit is this notion that we come together specifically to be of benefit to the world, not for any other reason. That's the reason to gather and to assemble. So I thought I'd just start with that reflection and maybe turn it over to the next of our guests. Have I talked long enough?
It's a good point to turn it over when you're ready to turn it over, and then we'll come back to it.
Then we can converse. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And so, Beth.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Willa, also. When Sarah asked if I would share thoughts about community, I leapt at the chance. I was really excited because I think it is, as Sarah said, so crucial to the opportunities before us, and also not so prominent, at least in my world, which is focused on climate change. I don't know how many 10,000 instances of clean tech for every one instance of community in our set of solutions to climate change. And I have a feeling that's the exact, like it should actually be the reciprocal of that. So I think to preface my thoughts about community, I should tell you more of my experience of community just briefly and name the many flavors, all of which, I don't know, I feel like produce the same set of conclusions for me about community. So one is I'm a mother, so I have that biological perspective of pregnancy. I'm fascinated by the fact that most likely, having been pregnant twice, there are cells of my children in my brain. Some of you might know that biological fact that fetal cells migrate to the brains of mothers. So community immediately raises also questions of boundary, what's in and what's out. And in my field of systems theory, where you draw the boundaries is really an important topic. I'm a gardener. My husband, Phil, and I grow as much of our own food as we can, which is impossible without community with the sun, with plants, with soil, with microorganisms. I'm a systems analyst, which brings also this, this awareness of boundaries. Where does the apple begin before I eat it? You know, it's not me, and then it is me, and then I metabolize it and it's not me anymore. So what does community mean in a world like that? Is a question that I think about a lot. The other systems principle that I use to frame community is the idea of emergence. So in systems theory, Emergence is when the behavior of a system changes by virtue of the connections within it. So the classic example is water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. So you can't at all know the properties of water, a liquid, by only studying the properties of hydrogen and oxygen, two gases. So when we come together in community, when new connections are formed between parts, there's this potential for novel behavior. It's one of the main sources of novelty. And so for me, that's where hope and community meet as we face all these existential threats. Clearly, we need novel behaviors, and emergence is a key source of that. So a lot of my professional work is about trying to foster connections within parts of systems, which is just another way of saying community. Sarah mentioned this word multi-solving that I coined 5 or so years ago. I didn't invent the possibility at all, but I was observing it as colleagues and I looked at really innovative approaches to climate change. We saw that there was one type of approach that was, I think of it as rewiring systems, so creating new connections across parts of systems. And I'd offer that as another definition of community. So just to make it more concrete, one example that we studied was a program in New Zealand that did energy upgrades on homes, but they noticed that the people living in those homes were having much better health outcomes after the renovations. So the project started to include the public health ministry, and soon doctors could refer patients for home energy upgrades. The project saved 3 times more money than it cost. So another thing about community, people always say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Sometimes the whole can also just be more effective than the sum of the parts. Yet we live in this world that's still trying to solve problems by breaking them down into their parts. And I would argue that the whole trajectory of colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, those are all anti-community, anti-communitarian processes. If you chop down a forest and turn it into profit, that is destroying a web of connection, right? That's the opposite. If community is building a web of connection, we're living off of these stored webs of connection right now, and we're reaching our way toward a different way of living that starts with reweaving those connections. So I'm happy to talk more in the discussion about multi-solving and how that connects to community. The last example I hold up is Sarah mentioned also that I live in an intentional community. I have for more than 20 years. We were one of the founding families. So I have the real gift of the experience of starting with a vision of community as someone raised in kind of typical middle-class America with probably limited skills of community. 20 years of trying to put that into practice, everything from making decisions by consensus. In fact, later this afternoon, we have a community meeting about our annual budget for 2022, which we will decide by consensus. Raising my children in community, and doing that in the context, not just of housing and where people live, but also managing 280 acres of forest and farm together. So there's the community among the people, and then the community of the people with the landscape, where we try to gain as much of our own sustenance as we can. And I will say that maybe the last thing to say, because I'm sure I'm near the end of my time, is that all these different facets of community have taught me that it is, like so much in systems, a very fractal phenomenon. And one example I would just offer, because some of my work has led me to the UN climate negotiations. And then I just told you I live in a community of 23 families who make decisions by consensus, just like happens at the UN, right? One country can block progress at the United Nations. One individual can block movement in my community. The two feel sometimes so similar to me, and every level in between. And of course, we also can look within our own bodies, which are communities of cells. And within those cells are communities, ancient communities, right? I think most of you know that our mitochondria were actually once free-living microorganisms that fused with other cells to enable the eukaryotic cells that we are today. So we've talked a lot about like community in space, but there's also community in time. Someone said to me the other day, maybe this will be my last thought to share. Mammals on Earth are 500 and something million years old, and your heartbeat today is continuous with 520 million years of heartbeats, right? Birth after birth, there was never more than some number of seconds or minutes between heartbeats. So community is inescapable. It really is the fabric that holds us. And we've allowed a worldview to really fray parts of community. But if you change how you think about it, there's, I believe, so much holding us, as Sarah said, that actually is incredibly strong. And so in these challenging times, there is a huge force to let ourselves be held by as we try to go forward. Thanks, and I look forward to hearing Kathryn's thoughts.
Beth, thank you so much. And welcome, Kathryn. Please join in. Yes.
Maroaweka, that's often translated as hello in Comanche, but only if you're speaking to 2 or more people. But that's not the real translation. If you know the fundamentals of the Comanche language, it really means talk to me. It's reciprocal. And so I wanted to share with you today some core cultural values of not only the Comanche tribe, but several other tribes. And these were first articulated by Americans for Indian Opportunity. The first of what we affectionately call them the 4 R's is relationships. So Comanches believe that we are related to all human beings, not just other Comanches, not just other indigenous people, but all human beings are related. But we also believe that we're related to all of the animals and all of the plants. We even believe in what Euro-Americans think of as inanimate objects like mountains. We believe we're related to mountains and stones. And that web of relationships call forth the second R, which is responsibility. If you're related to someone, that gives you a certain type of responsibility. So if, for example, we say, Mother Earth is our mother, the earth is our mother, then your responsibility as a good relative is to take care of Mother Earth. That you have to be an environmentalist based on your responsibility to that relationship. The third R is reciprocity. It is all about the cycles of life, cycles of human life, cycles of nature, cycles of the season, cycles of death and life. All of those reciprocal relationships envelop you in a wonderful and total way of living and way of existing. And the last R is redistribution. Now, sometimes people in capitalist society get a little worried when you start talking redistribution, because it immediately brings up, having to break up the land and redistribute wealth. but it also is the concept of redistribution of your behavior, your knowledge, your skills. If you have a skill in making songs, you can actually give that to someone. If you have a idea about community, you can share it with a group. If you have knowledge or just support, that is something you can contribute to the community. So all of those 4 R's are in a system of balance and nurturing of community. So the Sarah brought up that wonderful connection between the scientific definition of community, and there were some words in the original definition that she sent us that I wanted to emphasize. It's a group of organisms or populations living and interacting with one another in a particular environment. The organisms in a community affect each other. They affect each other's abundance, distribution, and ultimately evolutionary adaptation. So, as she said, they can be as small as a tree or a pond, or as big as a planet. But it's that affecting each other and the issues of whether we're going to have abundance, whether we're going to have scarcity, how are we going to evolve to the next stage? All of those things are reciprocal. And if you start acting on those or thinking about those processes and thoughts, then you have something more to give back to the community that we all live in. And that leads us to movement building, whether it's being a quiet witness for evolutionary and environmental practices, whether it's being an activist. All of that becomes the movement of the community toward a better future. So those are my thoughts to begin our conversation together.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank all three of you. And we'll get all 4 of us up on the screen at this point. There we come. I think we should go back around the circle and just see what has come to mind for you based on what you've heard. Willa, what would you like to say from here?
I was just struck by when Kathryn was just now talking about this R of responsibility, and that also has very much, in my own experience, been a big part of a successful community or balanced community is when all the members of the community are in reflection about their responsibilities, and one of the responsibilities of community is to steward life, steward life within the community. But like the Comanches, indigenous Asian communities see the natural world as fully animate. The natural world is not holding the community. The natural world is not materials to be used by the community. The natural world is the community. And that is very true in these indigenous environments in Asia, where I've spent quite a bit of time in Bhutan, Nepal. And in those environments, the streams, the trees, the rocks, the mountains, they all have names, and they are all beings and alive with the spirit world. So to touch anything, a rock, a tree, you are, when you touch a tree or a rock, you are touching the territory of the spirit world that is part of your community. So it's any resource that we use in that context, we must use with care and with respect and protection, the sense of protecting that as we would protect our own body. So just the resonance that I hear in some of the Native American perspectives on community vis-a-vis the what we would say in our culture is inanimate or resources to be used is very similar. And also just a thought on the role of consciousness that I want to bring in here as part of the possibility or the potential of community to be a kind of holding space for the metamorphosis of consciousness, the metamorphosis of mind, however you want to think of that, as the metamorphosis of cognitive framing or the metamorphosis of introspection and self-knowledge, but that to steward community, and this is that we first have to steward our own consciousness, and that to steward our consciousness, we have to understand what is it? So just the possibility of community for creating an environment where we can introspect together, not alone, not introspection as a solitary process, but introspection as a community process in which we're deepening in our self-awareness so that we can be more mindful with our actions. Just another thought to bring into the conversation.
Beth, what would you like to add?
Oh, it's so rich.
It really is.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe pull a couple threads forward. I guess maybe to build on what Willa just said about her sense of, I forget the word you used, Willa, but resonance or coherence between indigenous cosmologies in Asia and what we heard from Kathryn as one example of an indigenous cosmology on this continent. As someone steeped in systems theory, which comes from a very different place, right? Computer models, studies of feedback loops, studies of complex systems. I feel like the teachings are the same, which I think is a really profound thing, that I think we're pointing at something about how the world works, how the universe works, if different ways of knowing converge at similar insights, right? And so systems theory leads to the same ideas about our responsibilities to one another, but we talk about them as balancing feedback loops, right? If I neglect when another part of the system says, ouch, right? Whether that's, in an individual relationship when I harm someone, or when the earth says, ouch, systems theory says, well, there will be that's a feedback loop, right? And you have the opportunity to either respond by modulating your behavior or not. But if you don't, the feedback loop doesn't go away. It's still there and it will show up in some other way. And somehow it's bringing to mind for me also my mentor, Donella Meadows, who was a systems theorist. And one thing she said to me once was, when rational analysis and systems theory and ethics point in the same direction, you can be really sure that's a good direction to go. And I think of that a lot of times when I hear these or feel, it's actually more of a feeling than a rational thing, just that the coherence from very different approaches to looking at the world.
Absolutely. as Willa said, these core cultural values aren't really about just the Comanches or just natives in the US. They really are Indigenous people worldwide. We have a sister organization in New Zealand of the Maori people, and you know how much there is that resonance and cohesion in thought and what we're trying to accomplish. And that's true, I think, of Indigenous people worldwide. And each of you today in the audience has people in your ancestry who knew these things. And how we get disconnected is through the industrial world. And so how do we reconnect with those thoughts, those ways of knowing, those ways of being? And Beth, you know, I love your connection between systems thinking and that, because it is all reciprocal. It is a way of understanding the universe.
It's also so powerful in all of what you're saying that this is not a voluntary thing, being in community. This isn't something we've named and we call out. We simply are in community. It's inescapable. You know, the entire earth is a community. And so it's that's been occluded, as you say, Kathryn, by Western industrial society. And that we're in naming it and beginning to lean into it. Again, there's a reemergence that we may be able to nurture in consciousness around this continuing reality of our existence as a whole entity, a living entity. Other thoughts as we begin to come to our breakout time, I just want to see if anyone has any other things they want to say. This has been such a rich sharing already. Any other comments?
Maybe just one other thing. I'm just bringing different dimensions of consideration about what is community and what is its potential into the Zoom room, into our morning meeting here. Interesting in reflecting on community prior to us getting together here, and also prior to that article, I realized in looking at, there's sort of two ways to look at community. One is from the perspective of ideals. What is community? Kind of defining what it is. But then there's the other way of looking at community, is about the realities of lived community. Like Beth was saying, she lived her whole life in community, and the learning that happens when you're actually in it. Like what kind of models of decision making, like Beth was saying, she's going to go make some decisions with her community by consensus after this meeting here. So one of the things that came into my mind in terms of how to think about community is this question: what is the shape of our communities? And of course, in this community here, all of us gathered here, one of the shapes that we depend on is the circle, right? And I was imagining to myself, if we were actually together in body right now, all of us 38 people, we would probably be in a big circle, right? Because we're in a council situation, and how those shapes matter so much, it turns out. And that was something that in my younger life, I had not in my consciousness at all. And it was only through living in community for a long time that I began to realize that if your community is shaped like a circle or concentric circles, how different that is from a community shaped like a pyramid or shaped like a square, And that, so thinking about what are the shapes of our communities, and what is the flow of decision making can have a profound effect on even the most idealistic community with all of its wonderful ideals can collapse when the shape is out of alignment. So just bringing that into the space to be another thing we think about or reflect on.
It's wonderful to bring it back to the council process here at this point, because I love that we become more conscious of these meanings as we continue our work together and see what that means about shapes that we offer and support and move toward, and the kind of visioning and innovation, as Beth talks about it, that's possible in these spaces of community or communitas. So thank you for bringing that in right now, Willa. Beth and Kathryn, any other thoughts as we start to close? Beth?
Yeah, I would, I'll speak only for myself, but to say, I think it was Willa's words about the ideal, like community as an ideal or an abstract idea versus community as a practice, and how humbling it is to take up community as a practice, particularly for someone who's acculturated in a not very communitarian culture, right? I went to institutions like Dartmouth and MIT. I came from kind of middle class America, white person. And yet I think practicing it is the most important thing that we can do. It's when we come to these bigger challenges, right? Whether it's all the learnings that we're being given by this virus that we call COVID-19, which sure as heck tells us that it is a whole system, a whole global system, right? And how interconnected we all are. From climate change, each climate impact is really just a lesson on how to participate in the system that we're in and how not to participate in it. And because of this fractal nature that I was talking about, how community within your family is actually the same practice as community within your neighborhood, as within community of nations or your project team at work. And so sometimes I think we act as though there's like this big, like, oh, the big leverage point that we need to shift to fix this whole thing. And I believe that less and less and less. And I think it's millions of little moments day after day after day. So it's, how do I show up with my partner? How do I show up with my team, with my staff? The work that we're doing, we're trying to nurture these multi-solving partnerships that cross sectors. They cross, privileged versus not non-privileged. They're aiming for multiracial democracy in the United States as like a fundamental principle of them. They're so humbling. They're so hard. Most of the people I encounter are so not equipped for them. And yet, like, when I can point to where the bright spots are, that's always where they come from. And they all start with this softening. Like, the opposite of community, of course, is walls and boundaries. And we see in COVID-19, how our governments around the world are either meeting it with walls, or they're meeting it with open hands and literally community care, right? Whether that's sick leave or vaccination. And so I'm not quite sure where I'm going, except to just say, like, it's so hard and keep trying. I think it's those are the two things.
Oh, you guys, thank you so much for all of this wise visioning together. We have so much to think about from this time together. Thank you. And let's now go into our breakouts. We have some prompts for everyone to think about it together, but let's take a stretch. It's, I think, 11:50. So 5 minutes of break and some water or whatever you need. And then you'll find yourself in a breakout room. When you come back, Kyle will arrange all of that. And our conveners today are Walter and Diana and John and Kevin and Kurt and myself. And we really look forward to being with everybody as we think we're together in our small, emergent, liminal spaces, our creative spaces in the next hour. And thanks so much for being here. To be continued.